Warning: this video contains graphic and disturbing content of real-life events. Viewer discretion is advised. Gary Leon Ridgway, born February 18, 1949, is the American serial killer known as the Green River Killer. He was initially convicted of 48 separate murders and later confessed to nearly twice that number. As part of his plea bargain, an additional conviction was added, bringing the total number of convictions to 49, making him the most prolific American serial killer in history. He murdered numerous women and girls in Washington state during the 1980s and 1990s. Most of his victims were alleged to be prostitutes and other women in vulnerable situations. The press gave him his nickname after the first 5 victims were found in the Green River. His identity was not known. He strangled the women, usually by hand, although sometimes using ligatures. After strangling them, he would dump their bodies throughout forested and overgrown areas in King County, often returning to the dead bodies to have sexual intercourse with them. On November 30th, 2001, as he was leaving the Kensworth truck factory where he worked in Renton, Washington, he was arrested for the murders of 4 women whose cases were linked to him through DNA evidence. As part of the plea bargain wherein he agreed to disclose the whereabouts of still missing women, he was spared the death penalty and received a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. Ridgway was born the second of 3 boys in Salt Lake City, Utah, 1949. Ridgway's home life was somewhat troubled. Relatives have described his mother as domineering and have said that young Ridgway witnessed more than one violent argument between his parents. As a young child, Ridgway was tested with an IQ of 82, signifying below average intelligence. He did very poorly in school, and his classmates remembered him as being quiet and largely forgettable. His teenage years were also troubled. He wet the bed up until the age of 14, when his mother would find out about the incidents. She would have him march naked all the way into the bathroom. There she would bathe him and personally wash his genitals. This both aroused and embarrassed Ridgway, which caused him to have both sexual and violent fantasies about his mother. When he was 16, he stabbed a 6-year-old boy who survived the attack. He had led the boy into the woods and then stabbed him through the ribs into his liver. According to the victim and Ridgway himself, Ridgway walked away laughing and saying, "I always wondered what it would be like to kill someone." At age 21, after graduating from high school, Ridgway married his 19-year-old high school girlfriend, Claudia Craig. He then joined the Navy and was sent to Vietnam, where he served on board a supply ship. During his time in the military, Ridgway began frequenting numerous prostitutes and contracted gonorrhea. Although angered by this, he continued to have unprotected sex with prostitutes. While Ridgway was abroad, Craig had an extramarital affair. The marriage ended within a year. When questioned about Ridgway after his arrest, friends and family described him as friendly, but strange. His first 2 marriages resulted in divorce because of infidelities by both partners. His second wife, Marcia Winslow, claimed that he had once placed her in a chokehold. Ridgway had become religious during his second marriage, proselytizing door to door, reading the Bible aloud at work and at home, and insisting that his wife follow the strict teachings of their church pastor. Ridgway would also frequently cry after sermons or reading the Bible. Ridgway continued to solicit the services of prostitutes during this marriage. He also wanted his wife to participate in sex in public and in appropriate places, sometimes even in areas where his victims' bodies were later discovered. According to the women in his life, Ridgway had an insatiable sexual appetite. His 3 ex-wives and several ex-girlfriends reported that Ridgway demanded sex from them several times a day. Often he would want to have sex in a public area or in the woods. Ridgway himself admitted to having a fixation with prostitutes, with whom he had a love-hate relationship. He frequently complained about their presence in his neighborhood, but he also took advantage of their services regularly. It had been speculated that Ridgway was torn between his uncontrollable lust and his staunch religious belief. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Ridgway is believed to have murdered at least 71 women. Near Seattle and Tacoma, Washington, his court statements later reported that he had killed so many he lost count. A majority of the murders occurred between 1982 and 1984. The victims were believed to be either prostitutes or runaways picked up along the Pacific Highway. Most of their bodies were dumped in wooded areas around the Green River, except for 2 confirmed, and another 2 suspected victims found in the Portland, Oregon area. The bodies were often left in clusters, sometimes posed, usually nude. He would sometimes return to the victims' bodies and have sexual intercourse with them. Because most of the bodies were not discovered until only the skeletons remained, 3 victims are still unidentified. Ridgway occasionally contaminated the dump sites with gum, cigarettes, and written materials belonging to others, and he even transported a few victims' remains across state lines into Oregon to confuse the police. Ridgway began each murder by picking up a woman, usually a prostitute. He sometimes showed the woman a picture of his son to help her trust him. After having sex with her, Ridgway strangled her from behind. He initially strangled them manually. However, many victims inflicted wounds and bruises on his arm while trying to defend themselves. Concerned these wounds and bruises would draw attention, Ridgway began using ligatures to strangle his victims. He killed most victims in his home, his truck, or a secluded area. In the early 1980s, the King County Sheriff's Office formed the Green River Task Force to investigate the murders. The most notable members of the task force were Robert Capal and Dave Reichart, who periodically interviewed incarcerated serial killer Ted Bundy from 1984. Bundy offered his opinions on the psychology, motivations, and behaviors of the killer. He suggested that the killer was revisiting the dump site to have sexual relations with his victim, which turned out to be true. And if police found a fresh grave, that they should stake it out and wait for him to come back. Also contributing to the investigation was John E. Douglas, who has since written much on the subject of the Green River Killer. Ridgway was arrested in 1982 and 2001 on charges related to prostitution. He became a suspect in 1983 in the Green River killings. In 1984, Ridgway took and passed a polygraph test. Quality control protocols later developed in the FBI after careful review determined that Ridgway had actually failed. And on April 7, 1987, police took hair and saliva samples from Ridgway. Around 1985, Ridgway began dating Judith Mawson, who became his third wife in 1988. Mawson claimed in a 2010 television interview that when she moved into his house while they were dating, there was no carpet. Detectives later told her that he had probably wrapped a body in the carpet. In the same interview, she described how he would leave for work early in the morning, ostensibly for the overtime pay. Mawson speculated that he must have committed some of the murders while supposedly working these early morning shifts. She claimed that she had not suspected Ridgway's crimes before she was contacted by the police in 1987, and she had not even heard of the Green River Killer before that time because she did not watch the news. The samples collected in 1987 were later subjected to a DNA analysis, providing the evidence for his arrest warrant. On November 30th, 2001, Ridgway was at the Kenworth Truck Factory, where he worked as a spray painter, when police arrived to arrest him. Ridgway was arrested on suspicion of murdering 4 women nearly 20 years after first being identified as a potential suspect, when DNA evidence conclusively linked semen left in the victims to the saliva swab taken by the police. The 4 victims named in the original indictment were Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hinz, and Carol Ann Christensen. 3 more victims Wendy Caulfield, Deborah Bonner, and Deborah Estes were added to the indictment after a forensic scientist identified microscopic spray paint spores as a specific brand and composition of paint used at the Kenworth factory during the specific time frame when these victims were killed. On December 18th, 2003, King County Superior Court Judge Richard Jones sentenced Ridgway to 48 life sentences with no possibility of parole, and 1 life sentence to be served consecutively. He was also sentenced to an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence for each of the 48 victims, adding 480 years to his 48 life sentences. Ridgway confessed to more confirmed murders than any other American serial killer. Over a period of 5 months, police and prosecutor interviews, he confessed to 48 murders, 42 of which were on the police list of probable Green River Killer victims. On February 9th, 2004, county prosecutors began to release the videotape records of Ridgway's confessions. In one taped interview, he told investigators initially that he was responsible for the deaths of 65 women, but in another taped interview with Reichart on December 31st, 2003, Ridgway claimed to have murdered 71 victims and confessed to having sex with them before killing them, a detail which he did not reveal until after his sentencing. In his confession, he acknowledged that he targeted prostitutes because they were easy to pick up, and that he hated most of them. He confessed that he had sex with his victims' bodies after he murdered them, but claimed he began burying them later so that he could resist the urge to commit necrophilia. Thankfully, this monster is now locked away behind bars, but it goes to show the scariest stories are the true stories.